The topic for today is going to be the build-up to the American Revolution. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today. First of all, some basics to make sure that you understand some key pertinent information that's going to be really critical for the rest of this lesson. We're going to hear the term the 13 original colonies a lot today. Those just refer to the British colonies. So these colonies are under British rule, and they're mostly, well, they are all made up of states that are located right on or near the Atlantic coast of the modern-day United States. So states like New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, all parts of the original 13 colonies. Again, these colonies were all ruled by Great Britain, and there was a mutually beneficial relationship here. The British government did protect the colonies, so it's not as if the colonies are just benefiting from being British and the British aren't getting anything in return. They are protecting us and they are giving us a lot of benefits. But Britain also profited greatly from having control of these colonies. There's a really large amount of natural resources in America. And since the colonies were under control of Great Britain, they could pretty much exploit these resources in any way they wanted to. So the colonists benefited from being associated and being protected by Great Britain. And Great Britain benefited also because they could profit from the colonies. So it was a mutually beneficial relationship. In general, the colonists were treated well in America. It's not as if they were exploited by the British. But most citizens in Great Britain would not have thought of the colonists as their equals. They would not have called them English. They would have called them colonists. So there is a bit of a inferiority complex there. Next topic. The lack of unity. So even though it's a really complicated concept for us to understand. Even though the colonies were all united, so they were united under British control, they weren't united in the sense that we would think of today. So for example, colonists living in PA, they would really not consider themselves countrymen of colonists that were living in New Jersey. That's something that's foreign for us today because we think of us as all Americans. But the colonists really just thought of themselves as separate entities, separate countries, who just happened to be controlled by the same country. It's not that they fought, they mostly had good relationships, and they had a lot of things in common, but pretty much the governments were completely separated from each other, and there's really not that common sense of being countrymen that we see today in America. The French and Indian War is where we really start to see problems pop up. So the French and Indian War is fought between Great Britain and the French. It's also known as the 7 Years' War. Great Britain won that war, but it cost a whole lot of money to win that war, and Britain was really in financial trouble. And the British government decided that the colonists should be the ones that would have to carry that tax burden, because when you're in a big amount of financial trouble, what do? You raise taxes. So why did they decide that the colonists should be the ones that should carry this burden? Number one, the war was really mostly fought in America. And number two, kind of related here, since Americans gained a lot of territory from this war, they thought that they should help pay for it. And it's logical arguments, right? And you're going to see a map in a sec that kind of shows how much territory was gained during the French and Indian War. If you look at this map, the subset map right here, this little pink territory right here is the English territory before the French and Indian War, and you can see the English territory is pink after the French and Indian War. So we really gained a lot of territory as a result of the French and Indian War, so the British thought that the Americans should help pay for it. And King George III is the King of England at this time, and he decided to place some taxes on the colonists. And the most famous of these is called the Stamp Act. A lot of other famous taxes too, the Sugar Act, Townshend Acts, but the Stamp Act becomes the most notorious. The colonists, to put it lightly, they did not take it very well when they found out they were going to have to pay taxes by the decision of King George. Some reasons why. They knew that the British were also going to profit from this new land, just like they had always profited from the colonies. So why should we have to pay for it if they're going to profit from it? The big reason why, though, the Americans were not represented in the British Parliament. The British Parliament is the group, it's kind of like a Congress that we would think of in modern America, that approved these taxes. And there were no American colonists in that parliament. So their argument was they didn't have anybody that could vote against these taxes or argue against these taxes. So it's kind of unfair that they should have to pay these taxes. And they came up with a rallying cry that echoed this belief, and it's no taxation without representation. And even 18th century Americans loved catchy rhyming slogans. You can see that. Resistance. things started picking up a little bit more as the taxes became even more prevalent. One big event that kind of lit a spark under the colonists is called the Boston Massacre. Uh, Massacre is a bit of a stretch. It's kind of a propaganda term that was created by the colonists to make it seem worse than it was. But what happened is American colonists were harassing uh, British soldiers as they were walking down a street in Boston, throwing chunks of ice at them and putting rocks into snowballs and throwing the snowballs at them. The British soldiers felt threatened because it's starting to look like an angry mob, and someone fired. A British soldier fired at colonists. Some of his other soldiers fired afterwards after they saw that he fired, and in the end, 6 American colonists were killed. This was really, really, really lit a spark under the New England colonies, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island. Um, and it really brought a lot of people to the American movement. If they weren't in favor of independence before, they kind of were after the Boston Massacre. And a massacre is a bit of a stretch, but it's the name that stuck. The Boston Tea Party is the other event. Basically, the Boston colonists, it's Boston citing all these resistance movements, but they dumped a really large amount of British tea into Boston Harbor to protest against tea taxes. In response to the Boston Tea Party, the British passed what was called the Intolerable Act. It did a couple things. Closed Boston Harbor. If you're living in Boston at the time, a lot of people are merchants, which means they need a harbor to function worldwide. So this is a really big deal. It placed a curfew on Boston residents, which they obviously didn't like, and it also tightened the British control over the Massachusetts government. They don't have a lot of independence anymore. The British response not only angered people in Massachusetts, but it angered people all over the colonies. And this is a moment where you start seeing some people gather to the American cause, not just their own colony, which is kind of a first. Organization of the next part of the movement. Sensing that things weren't improving, representatives from 12 out of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia to talk about what they could do. These meetings became known as the First and Second Continental Congresses, very famous watershed meetings in American history. While they were talking, the first real battles of the American Revolution occurred, and they are called Lexington and Concord. The shot heard around the world was fired at these battles, and it kind of indicated since these were the first military engagements, the first actual fighting between the British and the colonists. And it kind of showed the people who were at the Continental Congress that this escalation into an actual fight, no longer just arguing or bickering or talking to each other, we're firing shots at each other. It's kind of showed the colonists that they were going to have to really consider completely separating from Great Britain. And that was an idea that not a lot of them had. They were still willing to try and negotiate with the British, but after these battles took place, they kind of started thinking to themselves, well, maybe we're going to have to declare independence. And that really sparked this movement. So the battles of Lexington and Concord are obviously really important in American history.